The elevator doors opened on the 47th floor of the Whitmore Tower, and Marcus Chen stepped into a world he'd only ever seen in magazines. His worn toolbox felt impossibly heavy in his calloused hands as he took in the sprawling penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city like a living painting. He was just there to fix a wheelchair, a simple job that should have taken an hour at most, but what he couldn't have known was that this single repair call would shatter every wall he'd built around his wounded heart and transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone in that gleaming tower. What happened in the weeks that followed would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, healing, and the invisible bridges that connect broken souls across impossible divides. If you believe that one act of genuine kindness can change everything, if you believe in second chances and the power of human connection, please hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories that remind us what it means to be human. Your engagement helps us share these powerful stories with people who need to hear them. Now, let's continue. Marcus had been working as a medical equipment technician for 3 years, ever since the accident that took his wife Sarah and left him to raise their daughter Emma alone. The job barely paid enough to cover their small apartment in the East End and Emma's after-school care, but it was honest work that let him be home most evenings. He'd learned to repair wheelchairs, hospital beds, and mobility devices through sheer necessity and determination, teaching himself from repair manuals and YouTube videos late at night after Emma went to sleep. Every adjustment he made, every wheel he aligned, every motor he fixed carried the ghost of his own loss because Sarah had spent her final 6 months in a wheelchair after the car accident, and he'd learned everything he could to make her comfortable, to give her some measure of independence even as her body failed her. The skills he'd gained in those desperate months had become his livelihood, his penance, and his only way of feeling close to the woman he'd lost. The penthouse belonged to Victoria Whitmore, the tech billionaire whose face appeared regularly on magazine covers and business news programs. Marcus knew of her the way everyone did, as a brilliant and ruthless businesswoman who'd built a software empire from nothing and who guarded her private life with ferocious determination. What the public didn't know, what had been carefully hidden behind layers of privacy and expensive legal agreements, was that Victoria had a daughter named Sophie who'd been in a catastrophic riding accident 4 years earlier. The accident had left Sophie paralyzed from the waist down at just 14 years old, and in the aftermath, as medical bills mounted despite their wealth and as Sophie's emotional state deteriorated, Victoria's marriage had crumbled under the weight of blame and grief. Sophie's father had left 2 years ago, unable to handle the transformation of his athletic, vibrant daughter into someone he barely recognized, someone whose anger and pain reflected his own failures back at him. Marcus was greeted at the door by Catherine, the full-time nurse Victoria employed to care for Sophie. Catherine was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. She explained that Sophie's custom wheelchair, which had cost more than Marcus earned in a year, had developed a persistent problem with the left wheel assembly that the manufacturer's technicians hadn't been able to solve despite multiple visits. The girl refused to use the backup wheelchair, refused most things these days, and Victoria was desperate enough to try an independent repair service. Catherine led Marcus through the stunning apartment, past rooms decorated with museum-quality art and furniture that looked almost too beautiful to use, until they reached Sophie's bedroom door. The room was dim despite the afternoon sun blazing outside because heavy curtains had been drawn across the windows. In the shadows, Marcus could make out the shape of a girl in a bed, turned away from the door, and the wheelchair positioned nearby like a mechanical sentinel. Catherine knocked softly and announced Marcus's presence, but Sophie didn't respond, didn't move, didn't acknowledge them at all. Catherine sighed with the patience of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times and told Marcus he could take the wheelchair to examine it. As he moved to do so, a voice cut through the darkness, sharp and bitter and much older than its 18 years. "Just take it, take the stupid thing and throw it away for all I care. It doesn't work, nothing works, nothing's going to work." Sophie still didn't turn around, but Marcus could hear something in her voice beyond the anger, something that reminded him achingly of Sarah in her darkest moments, a despair so profound it had nowhere to go but outward. Catherine's eyes met his briefly, apologetically, before she slipped from the room, leaving Marcus alone with this wounded stranger and her broken wheelchair. Marcus carefully wheeled the chair out into the hallway where the light was better. He could have taken it back to his workshop, probably should have, but something about that voice kept him there. He'd heard that particular shade of hopelessness before, had lived with it, had fought against it in the long months of watching Sarah fade. He set up his tools and began the examination, methodically going through each component. The wheelchair was a marvel of engineering, with responsive controls and a lightweight titanium frame, but sure enough, the left wheel had a wobble that shouldn't have been there. He worked quietly for 20 minutes, tracing the problem to a manufacturing defect in the axle housing that had been slightly misdrilled, creating uneven pressure that worsened with use. It was the kind of problem that looked minor but would drive someone crazy with its constant presence, the kind of thing that expensive technicians often missed because they were looking for complex issues when the solution was simple. He was drilling a new mounting point, carefully creating a better angle for the axle, when he realized Sophie had appeared in the doorway. She was using crutches, which surprised him, her legs thin and still in the expensive athletic wear that probably came from the days before she'd stopped caring. Her dark hair hung around her face like a curtain, and her eyes, when they finally met his, were red-rimmed and challenging. She was beautiful in the way of someone who'd forgotten how to see themselves as anything but broken, all sharp angles and defensive posture. Marcus nodded at her and kept working, not making a big deal of her presence, just like he'd learned to do with Emma when she was upset and needed to be near him without talking about it. "You're not going to ask me what happened?" Sophie's voice was acid, testing him. "Everyone asks. Everyone wants to know all the details so they can feel sorry for me and then feel better about their own perfect lives." Marcus continued adjusting the wheel mount, his hands steady and sure. He tested the rotation, found it smoother already, made another minute adjustment. Finally, he spoke without looking up. "I figure if you want to tell me, you will. And if you don't, that's your business. I'm just here to fix the chair." He could feel her staring at him, reassessing, trying to figure out what game he was playing. People probably didn't treat her this way, probably walked on eggshells or overcompensated with fake cheerfulness. He kept working because he understood that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was treat someone like they were normal, like they were capable, like they were more than their worst moment. Sophie moved closer, the crutches making soft sounds on the marble floor. She watched him work with an intensity that suggested she wasn't used to seeing people actually do things with their hands, actually create solutions instead of just throwing money at problems. Marcus explained what he was doing as he worked, not because she asked but because he sensed she needed to understand, needed to feel some control over this piece of equipment that had become both her prison and her lifeline. He told her about the manufacturing defect, showed her the uneven wear pattern, demonstrated how the new mounting angle would distribute pressure more evenly. She listened with a focus that seemed to surprise her, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, her defensive posture began to soften. "How do you know all this?" she asked, and her voice had changed, become younger, more curious. Marcus smiled slightly, still focused on the delicate adjustment he was making. "I taught myself. My wife, Sarah, she needed a wheelchair for a while before she passed away. The equipment we could afford kept breaking down, and I couldn't stand seeing her stuck, couldn't stand feeling helpless. So I learned. I read everything I could find, watched every video, practiced until I could take these things apart and put them back together in my sleep." He said it simply, without drama, but Sophie went very still. "Your wife died." The question was soft now, stripped of its earlier armor. Marcus nodded, testing the wheel rotation one final time before looking up at her. 3 years ago, car accident. She survived the crash but her spine didn't, and then complications from the injury, and then she was gone. We had 6 months together after the accident, 6 months of trying to figure out a new normal that never got the chance to become normal at all. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion he'd seen from her that wasn't anger or bitterness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and Marcus could hear that she meant it, that maybe she was apologizing for more than just his loss, maybe for her own anger and bitterness, for having given up when she was still alive to make choices. He stood and positioned the wheelchair in front of her. "Want to try it out?" She hesitated, and he could see the fear beneath the hesitation, the terror that it wouldn't be any better, that hope was more dangerous than resignation. But she lowered herself into the chair with practiced movements, and as soon as she began to move, her expression transformed. The wobble was gone. The chair moved smoothly, responsively, like an extension of her body rather than a clumsy mechanical intervention. Sophie wheeled down the hallway and back, then again faster, and then she was turning circles, testing the responsiveness, and there were tears streaming down her face but she was almost smiling, and Marcus understood that this wasn't really about the wheelchair at all. It was about someone actually fixing something, about someone seeing a problem and solving it rather than just expressing sympathy or throwing money at it. It was about being treated like a person rather than a tragedy. She wheeled back to him and looked up with eyes that were seeing him clearly for the first time. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than two syllables should hold. "I don't just mean for the chair. I mean for not treating me like I'm made of glass. For not pretending like everything's fine or like it's all terrible. For just being real." Marcus nodded and began packing up his tools. Everyone's fighting something. Some battles are just more visible than others. Doesn't make you any more or less deserving of respect. As he prepared to leave, Sophie asked him if he had any kids, and his face softened in the way it always did when he thought of Emma. He pulled out his phone and showed her a picture of his daughter, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with Sarah's smile and his determination. He told Sophie about how Emma was doing in school, how she wanted to be a doctor, how she'd helped him through the worst days after Sarah died by simply refusing to let him disappear into his grief. Sophie studied the photo with an expression that was hard to read, and then she said something that surprised him. "She's lucky to have you. You can tell she knows she's loved." And Marcus heard in those words all the things Sophie wasn't saying about her own family, about feeling alone in a penthouse apartment, about having every material need met while the emotional ones withered. When Marcus presented his bill to Catherine, he kept it minimal, just charging for the parts and a basic service fee. Catherine tried to insist he charge more, saying that Victoria would want to compensate him properly for solving a problem that had plagued them for months, but Marcus refused. "I fixed a wheelchair. That's all. The going rate for the work is fair enough." What he didn't say was that he couldn't bring himself to profit from another family's pain, that seeing Sophie's face when the chair worked properly was worth more than any amount Victoria Widmore could pay. Catherine looked at him with something like wonder and said that Sophie had already told her to make sure Marcus left his contact information because the chair would need regular maintenance. Marcus left the Widmore Tower feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't quite name. Something about Sophie had gotten under his skin, maybe because she reminded him of Sarah, or maybe because she reminded him of himself in those dark months after the funeral when Emma was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. He'd seen something in that girl that called to the part of him that still believed in healing, that still believed broken things could be made whole again if someone was patient enough to figure out how. 3 days later, Catherine called him with an urgent request. Victoria Widmore was traveling for business and wouldn't be back for a week, and Sophie was refusing to eat, refusing to leave her room, spiraling into one of the dark episodes that had become more frequent as the years passed. Catherine was at her wit's end, and Sophie had asked for Marcus, had said maybe he could look at her chair again, though Catherine suspected the chair was fine and Sophie just needed someone who understood. Marcus should have said no. He had a full schedule of repairs and Emma to think about, and getting more involved with a billionaire's troubled daughter was asking for complications he didn't need. But he remembered the look in Sophie's eyes when the wheelchair worked properly, remembered that moment of hope breaking through the despair, and he found himself agreeing to stop by. When he arrived at the penthouse this time, Catherine's relief was palpable. She led him to Sophie's room and knocked, announcing his presence. This time Sophie answered immediately, telling him to come in. The room was still dim, but Sophie was in her wheelchair, positioned by the window with the curtains partly open. She turned when he entered, and he could see she'd been crying. "The chair's fine," she said flatly. "I lied. I just wanted someone to talk to who doesn't work for my mother or get paid to pretend everything's okay." Marcus set his toolbox down and pulled up a chair, sitting so they were at eye level. "Okay," he said simply. "So let's talk." And Sophie, this girl who'd been locked away in grief and anger for 4 years, began to pour out her story. She talked about the riding accident, about her horse spooked by something she never saw and the terrible fall that changed everything. She talked about the surgeries and the therapy and the slow realization that she'd never walk again, never ride again, never have the future she'd imagined. She talked about her father leaving, about the way her mother had buried herself in work afterward, about feeling like a burden and a failure and a reminder of everything that went wrong. She talked about friends who stopped visiting, about being pulled out of school for privacy reasons, that really meant her mother was ashamed, about the endless parade of therapists and doctors and specialists who all said the right things but couldn't actually fix anything. Marcus listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes or trying to solve problems she wasn't asking him to solve. He just listened with the full attention of someone who'd sat in similar darkness and knew that sometimes you just needed someone to witness your pain without trying to explain it away. When Sophie finally ran out of words, exhausted and raw, Marcus told her about Sarah, really told her, not just the basic facts but the texture of it. He told her about the impossible anger of watching someone you love suffer, about the guilt of sometimes wishing it would just end, and then the more terrible guilt when it did. He told her about Emma's nightmares and his own, about learning to function when functioning felt like a betrayal of the one you'd lost. He told her that healing wasn't linear and it wasn't pretty and it didn't mean forgetting or being okay with what happened. But here's the thing, Marcus said, leaning forward with an intensity that made Sophie meet his eyes. You're still here. You're 18 years old and you've been through hell, but you're still here. That means something. That means you're stronger than you think, even if you don't feel strong. Even if you feel like you're barely holding on. The fact that you're still holding on matters. Sophie's face crumpled, and she started to cry in earnest, the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it feels like it might never stop. Marcus didn't try to shush her or comfort her, he just stayed present, letting her release years of pent-up grief. When she could speak again, Sophie asked him about Emma, asked how she'd coped with losing her mother. Marcus told her honestly that Emma still struggled sometimes, that she saw a counselor regularly, that grief didn't follow a schedule or resolve neatly. But he also told her about Emma's resilience, about how she'd started volunteering at a food bank, about how she'd told him once that losing her mom taught her that life was too short to waste on being afraid. She said if something that bad could happen, then anything could happen, so she might as well try for the things that matter. Sophie listened with an hunger that told Marcus how starved she was for real connection, for conversations that didn't treat her like she was fragile or finished. That first real conversation turned into regular visits. Marcus started stopping by the penthouse twice a week, officially to perform routine maintenance on Sophie's wheelchair but really just to talk. He brought Emma once, nervous about how they'd interact, but his daughter's natural warmth and complete lack of pity for Sophie's situation broke through the last of Sophie's defenses. The girls bonded over a shared love of old movies and a wicked sense of humor, and Emma treated Sophie exactly like she treated everyone else, with genuine interest and zero awkwardness about the wheelchair. Sophie seemed to come alive in Emma's presence, laughing at her stories about school drama and terrible cafeteria food, asking questions about Emma's friends and dreams, becoming gradually less focused on everything she'd lost and more curious about the world that was still spinning outside her curtained windows. Marcus watched the transformation in Sophie with a mixture of hope and concern. He could see her beginning to emerge from the shell she'd constructed, could see moments of genuine joy breaking through the depression, but he also worried about what would happen when Victoria returned and discovered this strange relationship her daughter had formed with the repair technician. He'd heard enough from Sophie,